Now we will listen to a conference by Maja Sakari on Helene Schjerfbeck. So enjoy your conference. Hello, everyone. I will speak in French. I think in the program it said that I would speak in English, but I will actually speak in French. Is it all right for you? Yes? Okay. So, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here to speak about Helene Schjerfbeck, which is a quite unique artist in Finland as well as internationally. She was born in 1862 and she lived until 1946. And I don't know, but maybe you've seen her exhibit here or in Paris at the Museum of Modern Art of the city of Paris. Maybe a few of you, maybe some of you have seen it. And there were also some of her paintings in the Louis Vuitton exhibit. I'm talking about the last Schjerfbeck's book portraits. Now, I'm going to tell you about her because I guess not everyone knows her, so I'll speak about her whole career. I'd say that her career was divided in two. There's some dual aspects in her life. So her life and her work are dual. Until 1902, she traveled quite some, and she was under international influence. And in 1902, she she to a small town a few kilometers, 50 kilometers away from Helsinki, to take care of her mother. And she stayed in solitude until she died. Of course, she had friends and people around her, but she didn't travel anymore. She stopped traveling, until after 1902. Now, in this first picture here, in this first slide, you see some self-portraits. She's famous for her self-portraits. She's made about 40 of them, especially at the end of her life. She concentrated on herself. And in these self-portraits, we may see how she had a dual life. She was quite introverted, but as well as extroverted. So there was always this, she was always dual. Now, I'll start with her childhood. Her childhood was quite exceptional because she was damaged because she fell in the staircase when she was 4 years old, and that's when she started drawing. Her father worked as a civil servant for the Finnish railway, and he recommended that she drew because she was to be in bed for several months, and she didn't go to a regular school. The teacher would visit her. So since her childhood, she was a solitaire. And in this slide, you can see her father on the left. And she also had a brother. She had a sister who had died before she was born. So her brother and her self-portrait when she was 18. And then in the middle, you see a gentleman, Einar Reuter, who later in the 1910 became her friend and supporter and sponsor. And actually, he's the one who wrote her first biography. She came from a bourgeois family, so her father was a civil servant, and he went bankrupt in a small town where they lived, and then they moved to Helsinki. But still, it was a bourgeois family. And the mother had a from her mother's side, she had an aunt who was married to an aristocrat, and they had a manor. You can see it on the left side, the Schönblum manor. She painted lots of pictures of that manor, and it was quite relevant for her because she would spend summers there and holidays. And on the right hand, you see a drawing by her of her workshop that she had that she shared with another Finnish artist, Maria Beck. The situation in Finland for artists is in the 1870s was a bit specific because we belonged to Russia. We were an autonomous country, but at the same time, we really wanted to create our own culture, our own cultural traditions. And in 1846, we founded the Fine Arts Society of Finland. And that's where we started teaching the future artists. So that was the School of Drawings of the Fine Arts Society. And that's when Helene Schjerfbeck started when she was 11 years old. She was quite precocious. Someone showed her drawings that she had made when she was young, when she was a little girl, to an artist, Arno von Becker, and he asked to take his little girl to the drawing school. Generally, one could only join that school when one was 12, so it was exceptional to have someone start that school when they were 11. And she stayed in that school until 1877, and then her father died when she was. Her father died. Sorry, so she stayed in the school until 1917, and her father died, which was a tragedy for the family. But a friend of the family kept on helping her to keep on study painting. In the drawing school, they basically taught drawing and not painting. But what was also interesting was that it was for men as well as for women. And this was not the case for the fine arts, the rest of fine arts academies in Europe. Only men could join these academies. That's why in foreign countries, women could only study in private workshops. Like when Helene Schjerfbeck went to France, it was the case. She continued in private workshops, but she was noticed in the school. And at the time, the tradition was followed. I mean, it was the tradition from the fine art academies from abroad. And fine art academies, genres were classified in art. So there was historic painting. In hierarchy, it was the highest one. Then there was landscape, portraits, etc. So Helene Schjerfbeck showed that she could paint great topics. That's why she painted that wounded soldier. It's the first one that was bought by the Fine Arts Society in the lottery of this society, and it became part of the collection of the society. And she received a prize for this painting. This painting tells about the story of our Napoleon Wars, because since in 1808 we became autonomous from Russia. So it tells the story of a soldier who was wounded and others left him or not. We don't know, because here one can tell whether the others will come and save him or if they've all left. So it's an enigma. But here you already see in that painting as interpreted as a self-portrait for Schjerfbeck, who is solitaire, and she was also wounded because she became the rest of her life because from her left leg, so she was also a bit of an invalid. Of an invalid, sorry. And in 1880, she got a grant to go abroad. She went to France because that was the most acknowledged academy for artists. She started with the Tréla Academy and then the Colarossi, and that's where she started painting oil. And then these were drawings that she made at the time that show her how mature she was. She was actually extraordinarily mature. At the time, the style was naturalism and realism, and she followed. Of course, she went to the Louvre as well as to other museums, and she followed the art of that time, as well as, but of course, she didn't know Impressionists, not at the time at least. Here, one sees some paintings on the left. We see the young girl and the Madonna. She was inspired into paintings, these paintings, after visiting the Cluny Museum. She visited several museums that influenced her. And in the lower part of the slide, we see a painting where she painted her friend because she had friendships at school. It's Marian Klandesberger, who was an Austrian, also painter, whom with she stayed friend her whole life. And this Mariana got married later to a British artist, and that's she went with her to paint in St. Ives. Oh, I didn't mention it, but there will be an exhibit at the Royal Academy this summer, actually to show. And at the base of this exhibition is Helene Schjerfbeck's trips to Brittany as well as to Great Britain. And she had friends. I mean, when she traveled, she felt really free. She liked that bohemian type of life from Paris and from the artists. And she also worked in the colony she worked in the summer camps in Brittany. In 1981, she went to Brittany, to Concarneau, to paint. And that's where, yes, that's where she painted the little boy who feeds his little sister. And this is quite a touching painting. At the time, she sent it to Finland to an exhibit of the Fine Arts Society, but she received quite negative criticisms, reviews, because and people said that criticized the fact that she painted poor and ugly children, and that she should paint more outstanding characters. But Helene Schjerfbeck shows her quality. She shows that she wants to have her own voice. And if we analyze the painting itself, we see that the colors are few. She doesn't have very clear or bright colors. And also the way she paints is not too accurate, which was the case with historic paintings or other types of traditional paintings. She was more interested in painting itself, in the way to paint, and not so much in the topic. Of course, she found this topic interesting, but she got such bad reviews from this painting that she hesitated to go to a more traditional kind of painting or a more modern one. But she was quite audacious and courageous in the end. Right, here I'd like to show you on the left another friend of Schjerfbeck, Annette Annie Anker, who actually painted Helene Schjerfbeck on the left, and her friend Helena Bestermark, who is on the right. It's a portrait of Helena Bestermark by Helene Schjerfbeck. And apparently, Helene Schjerfbeck changed her first name due to Helena Bestermark because it was the same name. So she chose the French version, Hélène. But she was quite aware at the time of her career, of her maturity, of her talent. So she was quite self-aware as an artist. And here's a picture of the workshop with friends. She was engaged to a Swedish, we don't quite know who it was because that was also a drama, a tragedy, Helena Holger, who is a specialist by Helena Schjerfbeck, said that her fiancé was probably the man sitting in front of the women. And Helene Schjerfbeck is behind with the beret, and on the left is Marianne Freindesmerger. So, her stays in France and in Finland, in Paris, and then in 1882 she went to Finland. She spent the summer in Schönberg in the manor, and there she painted such paintings, the dance shoes. This is her little cousin who was her model. And again, this painting shows it's a bit conventional, but later she drew several versions of that painting which are more modern. And they don't have such a conventional flavor anymore. And also, this painting was painted during her stay in Finland. And this was the first painting that she offered to the Salon de Paris. And she even got a prize, the bronze prize, I think it was. But here again, we see quite a funny subject. Why paint Jews? She wasn't Jewish. So when she picked her topics, she was never conventional. Here, one sees that she really hesitated between realism and a more modern and concentrated style. In her portrait on the left-hand side, we see that she's open, that she acknowledges herself as an artist. She really looks like she's happy, that she's self-confident. And on the right side, the topic is a bit more conventional. That's also because the fine art societies orders were conventional. They expected from her more conventional topics that they could show in exhibits, and so the taste was more conventional. That's why she also painted this type of paintings with realistic subjects. Here, you see, she left to paint with Marianne Breidelsberger and Maria Wieck. I think there was also Aratilène, one of her friends, who went to paint in Pont-Aven. Of course, you all know Pont-Aven. It was a place where lots of artists went, even Gauguin. I don't know if Helene Schjerfbeck met Paul Gauguin, but I know other Finnish artists even worked in Gauguin's workshop. But anyhow, that's where, during that trip in Brittany in 1884, that Schjerfbeck fell in love with that Swedish man. And one sees somehow her freedom. She was free to paint topics that had no special value. What mattered for her was the painting itself and not the subject. As you see on the picture on the left side, is just called a door. And it was painted near Mayence, at Trématon, in Trématon. It's in a chapel in Trématon, near Pont-Aven, and she painted it for herself. And it's actually, I mean, one sees that she also understood that some may not have understood that painting because she only showed it in 1918 or 1919 in her exhibit on water, organized by the art salesman Øystein Stempel. But I'd like to quote an article from the catalogue for the exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art of the City of Paris. She says on this painting, the door, the space that the door closes on seems empty and quiet. It's deeply dark and stops the light and only lets one string of light in. And in spite of the limpid construction, the eye has no spot on which to lay, no spot where our gaze could stay. On a pillar on the right, it seems like there's some space, and it makes us think that this is the entrance of an old chapel that must get its light from a second source. And end of the quote. So this is a piece of work that has no subject. It is subjectless somehow. So it's quite modern, and it is actually a painting, an unprecedented painting. And at the time, during the 1880s, nobody painted that way, and it was quite shocking. That's why she didn't want to show that painting in exhibits. And then the painting on the right-hand side is also a painting that could have been made anywhere. It was actually painted in Pont-Aven. And this painting, drying laundry, it was painted during her stay in Pont-Aven. She sent it to Finland for the annual exhibit of the Fine Arts Society. And their critics did not understand at all why she would show such laundry is dirty. Of course, here it's clean, but still, it's just laundry. Of course, when we see it now, one can say that it's a piece of work. It's a masterpiece because she painted the material, the shades, the net, the fish's net. So it is actually quite exceptional and charming. But at the time, people did not understand it. That's why she followed what the audience wanted at the time, and that's why she continued painting in a more realistic way. After, or in a more traditional way, then in 1884, she went back to Finland. She was still in love with that Swedish artist, but in the end, the artist broke up with his engagement. And that was a tragedy for Helene Schjerfbeck. And the reason why her fiancé didn't want to marry Helen was that his family didn't accept him to marry an invalid because they thought that it came from tuberculosis. And at the time, people thought that it was hereditary disease. So it was a shock for Helen. She was sad. She was depressed. But fortunately, her friends, Marianne Pradensperger, as well as Maria Wieck, helped her leave again to St. Ives. And Marianne Pradensperg, who was married to another English artist, invited her to paint there. And it was a kind of convalescence for her. That's when she started working again, and she resumed work. And here, the different paintings. Well, she had been in Paris, so the right-hand painting, child and her mother, was painted in Paris, and the girl from St. Ives painting was, of course, painted there in St. Ives. But one can reflect upon this painting, the child and its mom. It must have been quite painful for her because at the time she knew that she would not have children because her fiancé had left her.
So perhaps the most famous work that she's done was called Convalescence, and this was also exhibited at the Salon de Paris in 1888. So at the time, it was called the first reading, La Première Verdure, but also this was seen as a self-portrait of the artist, somebody very fragile. So the beginning of spring, summer arriving, and we have this little girl here who is ill, who is convalescing, who is getting over her illness. Now in St. Ives, Helene Schjerfbeck, well, she stayed there for about 2 years, and she went back again at the end of the 1880s. But in the meantime, she spent some time in Italy. At the time, the idea of the fine arts was to send artists abroad so that they could go and copy very iconic, famous artists like Raffaello, Velázquez, Murillo. So you can see you see this little, you can see the same thing in the little boy feeding his sister. There's an influence of Quillo. But in Italy, she painted, well, she painted all the time, in fact. So she has about 1,000 works to a name, and we still keep finding more. We don't know In England, for example, there are some works that she sold there, but we don't know where those works are. But here we can see the influence of Alcott Bucklin in terms of the landscape behind. And here she came back to Finland, where she worked as a teacher at the School of Drawing. At the end of 1890, her brother got married, and this was a tragedy for her because she then had to take care of her mother. Here is her mother. This is a portrait of Helene Schjerfbeck's mother. And when she didn't travel anymore, didn't travel abroad, she moved in with her mother in a small town called Hyvinkää, and she stayed there until her mother's death in 1923. And she just had a couple of friends and her neighbors to use as models. She couldn't travel anymore, but she did correspond with other artists, with Maria Vika, Marion Stokes, amongst others. And this is kind of the second part of her life that started once she moved to Hyvinkää. And that's where she really worked with and found her own style, found her own way of painting more simply, using fewer colors, but a very expressive representation. So psychologically, she knew a lot about her models. In terms of this painting of her mother, we don't see a full face. We never look into her mother's eyes. So perhaps we can interpret this. Perhaps this was because the mother didn't want her daughter to be an artist, so there was a lot of tension between her and her mother. But also in other portraits and works that she did at this particular time, she often showed people looking down, so no eye contact. And as I said at the beginning of my presentation, there's a kind of duality between the inward-looking and outward-looking within herself, because she liked people, but she was very selective about whom she wanted to be with. Now, at that particular time, that era, the source of influence was the art magazines. She subscribed to those. They weren't the most modern ones, but they were the art magazines that talked about art and art history, and sometimes she bought the studio. And she was very interested in fashion magazines as well. So this is very interesting if you look at her work to see how that trend developed and what she found interesting. So we can see in the portraits of that era, she was also interested in Japonism, so things that came from Japan. So Hamalazinda, there were a lot of articles on different subjects, so she was able to choose what she was interested in. And once again, in all these works, they're very silent. There's a silent quality, the kind of peacefulness that you can see in these works. But there was another style as well, like this one here, the skia. So we know The model was an English girl. The father had been to Houwinka to work for a new factory there. And a specialist that wrote for the Royal Academy, Jeremy Beeson. He mentions the influence of Rococo style in Schjerfbeck's work. And I find that this is very interesting because we can see that the models, it's almost as though they're wearing a mask. So once again, we have this dual character, the conflict between what people see and what the person feels from within. It's almost a caricature, if you like. So she's looking for something which is within the model, within the person, and within herself as well, because I think that a portrait painter must always put some of themselves in the painting, as it were. Now, that particular era, she got to know Emile Reuter, who's an amateur painter, Emile Reuter, and he wrote the first biography of Helene Schjerfbeck. And there was Justus Stearman, who was an art collector, and supported Helene. He bought several of her works when he met her the first time in 1913. And he organized several exhibitions of her work. So it's with Justus Stearman that Schjerfbeck was able to exhibit her works abroad. There were several exhibitions in Sweden, and Justus Stearman wanted to have a touring exhibition in the US, but unfortunately the war broke out. And so she wasn't able to be present in the US. But there was an exhibition after her death. Justus Stearman was very important for her career. At the end of her life, Justus Stearman had signed a contract with Helene Schjerfbeck. In fact, he paid her a salary for having access to her production. So he ordered copies of some of her works. But I think it was interesting for Helene Schjerfbeck, who wasn't really interested in the subjects, but was more interested in technique, the way of painting. So in some of her works, she used pastels that she scraped off right down to the canvas. So here we see an example of that. So her technique was rather unique. At the end of her life, she started, at the request of Justus Stearman, she started doing lithography. So you find several lithographies still today. And above all, she painted portraits. That's a kind of signature. She painted portraits, and you can see in the middle here, this is her version of an El Greco Madonna. And she continued to paint some of the major martyrs. The motorist here is her nephew, in fact. And once again, could say that the model is really kind of inward-looking, very reserved, and quite arrogant even. And so we've got the colors, the surfaces that are important. Now here I have a few more pictures, examples of self-portraits. This was when she was painting in the realist style. The right-hand, bottom right picture, this was ordered by the Société des Beaux-Arts. This was in 1915, because, in fact, they ordered 15 self-portraits, and she was the only woman artist amongst those 15 artists. But she was very much aware of her talent and her ability to paint. And that was exactly what she wanted to do. And once her mother had died, so this was her passion in life. There was no more, she didn't have to take care of anybody after that. And here, these are the last self-portraits. And once again, we have this dualism. If you look at the eyes, one eye, it's almost like it's blind, and the other one is looking towards the outside. So once again, this conflict between the inside and the outside. I read an article for the Louis Vuitton catalogue, where the author talked about an article by Jacques Derrida, Le Mémoire d'Alain, somebody who's blind, because I think that when an artist does their own self-portrait, they have to look in the mirror to do this. But when she looks at herself in the mirror, she can see something, but then when she comes to painting, she can't see. So it's this issue between seeing and being blind when you're painting. So this is something else that we see in the last self-portraits. Now we can compare this to Rembrandt or others, but it's very unique what she does, and very bold as well, because this is somewhere between life and death that's reflected in these self-portraits. Something that's very sincere, frank, and she really wants to show. So I'll leave it there to see if there are any questions. Thank you.
Est-ce qu'il y aura des questions?
Any questions? With the microphone, please.
Je pense que ça
Well, I think that it started quite late. She painted Finland, and those were shown at the Biennale in the 70s, I believe. But there was already, during her lifetime, there were already some exhibitions in Finland, but exclusive, but larger exhibitions, and so they started in Europe about 20 years ago, no more than that. So the modern art exhibition that was in 2007 in Paris, and Schirner Kunsthalle, that was about 15 years ago. So she wasn't very well known in Central Europe. She wasn't as well known as she is now. So we hope that the exhibition at the Royal Academy, this will be the first time she's been exhibited in England. Question of Mike. Yes, she had pupils like you, Maurice, but she didn't like teaching at all. And she didn't like to speak in front of people and teach, but in fact she was a very good teacher, people say. And she knew a lot about painting, so she was able to teach, but she didn't like it. Off mic. No, because she didn't have a lot of money. She read art magazines, so she knew what was going on in the art world. But perhaps she did own some of her friends' works, but she was a very humble, modest kind of person. And in Tamisaari, where she lived after the death of her mother, which is a very small city on the coast in the south of Finland, well, she lived very modestly. And also when she was with her mother, she didn't have a maid, for example, even if she was from a bourgeois family. Off mic, yes, I think they do. Yeah, she was a feminist, yeah, herself. She wanted to have a career, and she was she depicted this quite strongly in the painting. You can see in her letters as well. When Finnish women in 1909 had got the vote, she wrote that in a letter. She said that it was something that was really good, that finally that Finnish women had the vote. So yes, we can say she was a feminist, but we didn't talk about or say it in those terms at the time. Off mic. No, that didn't really happen. I don't know why, but perhaps people were more militant at that time. But I don't. But her works are so universal in terms of their themes that we could use them. Thank you.